The fog at the edge of the world tasted of salt and secrets. It rolled off the Atlantic in thick, bruised waves, swallowing the coastline of Briarwood Bay until the cliffs looked less like geography and more like a memory. Alara Vance stood on the rotting porch of the cottage, the iron key warm and heavy in her palm. It was the only thing of weight she had left. At 42, her life had been categorized, Dewey Decimal style, into a series of tragic, predictable volumes: The Dutiful Wife, The Silent Librarian, and the recently published novella, The Woman Whose Husband Left Her for a Yoga Instructor Named Sky. She shivered, pulling her velvet wrap tighter around her shoulders. The fabric was a deep, midnight blue, soft against the biting wind, but it did little to ward off the chill radiating from the house itself. Briarwood Cottage. The name sounded quaint, pastoral. The reality, however, was a brooding, timber-framed beast that sat perched precariously on the headland, groaning under the weight of neglect. "Just you and me, then," Alara whispered. Her voice sounded rusty, unused. She turned the key. The lock protested with a metallic screech that sent a flock of rooks scattering from the eaves, cawing their displeasure. With a shove of her shoulder, a shoulder that felt too soft, too rounded for manual labor, the oak door groaned open. The scent hit her instantly. It wasn't the smell of abandonment, of mildew and mouse droppings, though those were surely there. It was deeper. It smelled of dried sage, ancient paper, and something sharp and electric, like the air moments before a thunderstorm breaks. It smelled of her grandmother, Nana Rose, who had died with a smile on her face and a reputation that made the locals cross themselves when she passed. Alara stepped inside, her boots echoing on the wide planked floors. Dust motes danced in the slivers of gray light slicing through the boarded windows. The silence here wasn't empty. It was heavy, expectant. She dropped her bags in the hallway. A logical woman, a librarian who found comfort in the structural integrity of a well-organized archive, would have started with the kitchen. She would have checked the taps, the fuse box, the pantry. But Alara didn't go to the kitchen. A phantom thread, invisible but undeniable, tugged at her solar plexus. It was a physical sensation, a warm, rhythmic thrumming that pulled her gaze upward, toward the ceiling, toward the darkness of the upper floors. "Ridiculous," she muttered, brushing a wild curl of mahogany hair out of her eyes. "You are a grown woman, Alara. You are not a character in one of the Gothic romances you shelve on Tuesdays." Yet her feet moved. She climbed the stairs, the wood sighing beneath her weight. The banister was smooth under her hand, polished by generations of palms. Up she went, past the bedrooms with their sheets draped over furniture like ghosts, down the narrow hallway until she reached the narrow door that led to the attic. The pull was stronger here. It was a vibration in her teeth, a heat blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with menopause and everything to do with instinct. She opened the door. The attic was a cathedral of shadows. Beams of oak crisscrossed overhead like the ribs of a leviathan. Trunks were stacked haphazardly, surrounded by drying racks hung with brittle bundles of lavender, rosemary, and mugwort. The air was thick, suffocatingly dry, and yet the scent of ozone was overpowering. In the center of the room, resting on a simple wooden pedestal that looked suspiciously like an altar, sat a trunk. It wasn't large, but it commanded the space. Bound in iron and black leather, it seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. Alara approached it slowly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She reached out, her fingers trembling. The moment her skin brushed the leather, the air in the room vanished. A shockwave, silent and invisible, blasted through her. It wasn't painful. It was absolute. It felt like the first breath after drowning. The leather was warm, pulsing with a slow, steady beat that matched her own. Open it. The thought wasn't hers. It was deeper, ancestral. Alara unlatched the trunk. Inside lay a single book. It was massive, bound in rough, dark hide that looked disturbingly like skin, with no title on the spine. She lifted it. It was heavy, impossibly so, as if she were holding the weight of history itself. She laid it on the floor and sat cross-legged, her velvet wrap pooling around her like a dark sea. With a deep breath, she flipped the cover open. The pages were parchment, thick and cream-colored, covered in a spidery, elegant script she recognized instantly. Nana Rose's handwriting. But the ink shimmered. It wasn't black. It was a deep, verdant green, shifting in the light. "To the daughter of the daughter, when the blood is ready and the heart is broken," Alara traced the words. "Heart is broken," she whispered. "Check." As she read, a warmth began to spread from her fingertips, traveling up her arms, flooding her veins with a sensation that was terrifyingly luxurious. It felt like champagne and adrenaline. It felt like power. Around her, the room darkened, the gray daylight snuffed out as if by a giant hand. Then, the whispers started. Not voices, but the rustle of energy. Ignite. Alara gasped. The sensation in her chest expanded, demanding release. She didn't know what she was doing. She only knew she had to let it out before it consumed her. She threw her head back, her eyes squeezing shut, and pushed the energy outward. Whoosh! Alara's eyes snapped open. Surrounding her, a dozen half-melted beeswax candles, scattered on shelves and tables throughout the attic, had erupted into flame. But this was not normal fire. The flames were tall, steady, and brilliant emerald green. They cast no smoke, only a stark, beautiful light that threw her shadow long and sharp against the rafters. She stared at her hands. Her skin looked luminous, pearlescent in the green glow. The air around her rippled with heat. For the first time in 20 years, the tightness in her chest, the constant, low-level anxiety of trying to be perfect, to be small, was gone. In its place was a roaring river of vitality. "What is this?" she breathed, the words vibrating in the charged air. Bam! 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 The sound was like a gunshot in a library. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks on the front door downstairs. The connection snapped. Alara jolted, the book sliding from her lap. Instantly, the emerald flames guttered and died, plunging the attic back into gray gloom. The warmth in her veins turned to ice. The extraordinary bled away, leaving her merely Alara Vance, trespassing in a dusty attic. She scrambled to her feet, heart racing for a different reason now. Panic. Who would come here? The cottage was miles from town, smoothing her hair and clutching her wrap tight, armor against the mundane world. She descended the stairs. Her legs felt shaky, like she had just stepped off a boat. The residual hum of the magic still tingled in her fingertips, a secret she couldn't quite shake. She reached the front door. The knocking came again, precise and impatient. Alara unlocked the door and pulled it open. The man standing on her porch seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the air, replacing it with the scent of expensive wool and cold logic. He was tall, towering over her 5'4" frame, with shoulders that filled out a charcoal overcoat in a way that suggested military discipline rather than gym vanity. His hair was salt and pepper, cut with severe precision, and his face was a study in hard angles, a strong jaw, a nose that had perhaps been broken once, and lips pressed into a thin, unamused line. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were steel gray, piercing and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept over her, taking in the wild mahogany curls, the flushed cheeks, the velvet wrap, and the moss-green eyes that were wide with shock. He didn't look at her like a woman. He looked at her like a structural anomaly he was trying to assess. "Ms. Alara Vance?" His voice was a baritone rumble, smooth and dark as black coffee. "Yes," Alara managed, gripping the doorframe. She felt disoriented, the aftershocks of the attic still trembling in her knees. "Can I help you?" He didn't smile. If anything, his expression hardened. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded document. His movements were economic, wasting no energy. "I'm Julian Thorne," he said. He held the paper out to her, but didn't release it immediately when she reached for it, forcing her to step closer into his personal space. He smelled of rain, cedar, and the sharp tang of architectural blueprints. "And I'm afraid this isn't a housewarming call, Ms. Vance." Alara took the paper, her fingers brushing his leather glove. A static spark, sharp and biting, snapped between them. Julian blinked, his gaze flicking to their hands, then back to her face. A micro-expression of confusion rippled across his stoic features before he clamped it down. "What is this?" she asked, looking down at the legal jargon. "A condemnation order," Julian said, his tone flat, factual. He turned slightly, looking past her into the dark hallway, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the rotting beams of the foyer. "I've been retained by the Township Council. This structure has been deemed distinctively unsafe. The foundation is compromised, the load-bearing walls are rotting, and frankly, it's a miracle the roof hasn't collapsed on your head already." Alara felt a surge of defensiveness hot enough to blister paint. This was her sanctuary, the only thing she owned. "It's standing just fine, Mr. Thorne," she snapped, her spine straightening. "It has stood for 200 years. Gravity doesn't care about history, Ms. Vance. It cares about physics." He stepped forward, forcing her to retreat a step into the hallway. He crossed the threshold, uninvited. The moment his foot hit the floorboards, the house groaned. It wasn't a creak of old wood. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the soles of Alara's boots. The air pressure in the hallway dropped sharply. The scent of ozone returned, stronger this time, mingling with Julian's cedar cologne. Julian paused, looking down at the floor, then up at the ceiling. Dry rot, he muttered, entirely missing the supernatural warning. Sound travels when the timber is hollow. He looked back at her, his gray eyes locking onto hers. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises before I bring in the crew to stabilize the perimeter. I can't in good conscience let you stay here. It's a death trap. Alara felt it then. The surge. It rose from the floorboards, channeled from the book in the attic, rushing into her body like a tidal wave. Her skin began to prickle. The air around her hair began to crackle with static. Behind her, in the kitchen, a cupboard door slammed shut with a violence that made Julian flinch. He stared at her, his skepticism warring with his instincts. He stepped closer, looming over her, trying to intimidate her with his size, his logic, his paperwork. Ms. Vance, did you hear me? Alara looked up at him. She should have been terrified. She was a librarian with a terrifying ex-husband and a bank account approaching zero. But the emerald fire was licking at the back of her throat. She felt dangerous. She felt witchy. She tightened her grip on the door, fighting the urge to blast him backward with a power she didn't understand. I heard you, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a resonance that made the glass in the hallway mirror shudder. But if you think you can remove me from this house, you are going to need more than physics. Julian's eyes widened. Just a fraction. He looked at the mirror rattling in its frame, then back to Alara. For a second, the air between them was so thick it was hard to breathe. Then, a light bulb in the fixture above their heads exploded in a shower of sparks. Dear listeners, please leave a comment about which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel in the name of love. This will support me and give me inspiration for new stories. Glass rained down like solidified tears, chiming against the hardwood floor. The scent of ozone, sharp and metallic, instantly overpowered the lingering aroma of dried lavender Alara had spent the morning tucking into the linen closet. Julian Thorne did not flinch. He did not gasp. He merely lifted a hand to shield his eyes, the movement efficient and practiced, as if exploding light fixtures were a standard hazard of structural engineering. Alara stood amidst the sparkling debris, her chest heaving. The heat that had surged through her veins, that wild green fire, began to recede, leaving her fingertips tingling and her knees trembling. She looked at the man standing in her hallway, this intruder with his bespoke charcoal coat and eyes like a winter storm, and felt a sudden, terrifying urge to apologize, the reflex of a lifetime spent making herself smaller. But the cottage hummed beneath her feet, a low vibration of approval. Old wiring, Julian said. His voice was calm, clipped, and utterly devoid of wonder. He brushed a shard of frosted glass from his shoulder with a gloved hand. Knob and tube, likely. A fire hazard waiting for a spark. Alara stared at him. A fire hazard, she repeated, the words tasting flat after the resonance of her earlier command. Mr. Thorne, the bulb didn't just burn out. It detonated. Surges happen when the insulation degrades. It's physics, Mrs. Vance, not poltergeists. He stepped carefully over the debris, his leather boots crunching on the glass, closing the distance between them. For a moment, she thought he meant to intimidate her, but he stopped a respectful 3 feet away. His gaze dropped to her bare feet. Don't move, he commanded. It wasn't the bark of a drill sergeant, but the cool authority of a man used to being obeyed. You'll cut yourself. Before she could protest, he turned, strode to the entryway, where he'd left his heavy leather satchel, and retrieved a small, high-powered flashlight. He swept the beam over the floor, illuminating the treacherous landscape of shards surrounding her toes. I'm fine, Alara said, clutching her velvet wrap tighter around her chest. The silk felt cool against her flushed skin. I can sweep it up. We'll sweep it up later. Right now I need to see the foundation wall on the north face. That tremor wasn't just the mirror shaking. The floor joists moved. He looked up, his steel gray eyes locking onto hers. This house isn't just eccentric, Mrs. Vance. It's unstable. Alara felt a spike of indignation that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with loyalty. Briarwood Cottage was a living thing to her, a grandmother, a womb, a fortress. Calling it unstable felt like an insult to a matriarch. The north garden, she said, stepping carefully into a pair of slippers she'd kicked off earlier. If you must. The afternoon light was dying, strangled by the heavy canopy of ancient oaks that surrounded the property. Outside, the air was thick with moisture, smelling of wet wool, decaying leaves, and the deep, loamy scent of waiting earth. It was a witch's weather, brooding and pregnant with intent. Julian walked the perimeter of the cottage with a predatory grace. He moved like a man who trusted gravity, but nothing else. He touched the stone cladding, his fingers tracing the mortar lines, searching for weakness. He was a beautiful, severe thing against the overgrown chaos of her grandmother's garden. The silver at his temples caught the dull light, shimmering against the severe cut of his dark hair. Alara followed him, her velvet hem dragging over the damp clover. She felt the garden watching him. The hydrangeas seemed to lean in. The gnarled roots of the wisteria appeared to tense, ready to trip him. "Here," Julian said, stopping at the retaining wall that held the hill back from the kitchen entrance. The stones were moss-slicked, bulging outward like a heavy belly. He crouched, the wool of his coat stretching across broad shoulders. "Look at this shear line. The hydrostatic pressure is immense. There's no drainage. The water builds up behind the wall, freezes, expands, and pushes the stone out. It's basic mechanics." Alara moved beside him. She didn't see mechanics. She saw the way the moss had grown in the shape of protective runes, binding the stones together with a strength that defied mortar. She felt the pulse of the earth pressing against the house, an embrace, not an assault. "It has stood for 200 years, Alara murmured. "It holds because the land wants it to hold." Julian stood up slowly, dusting his hands. He looked down at her, a flicker of irritation tightening the corner of his mouth. "That is a romantic notion that will get you crushed to death in your sleep. I'm not trying to be your enemy, Alara. I'm trying to keep the roof from caving in on your head." It was the first time he had used her first name. It sounded heavy in his mouth, solid and real. "I don't need saving, Julian," she countered, the name slipping out before she could check herself. "And neither does the cottage. It needs to be listened to, not dissected." "Stone doesn't speak," he said, his voice dropping, gravelly with frustration. "Rot doesn't negotiate. Look." He reached out, grabbing her hand to guide it toward a fissure in the masonry. He intended to force her to feel the damp, crumbling mortar, to force the cold, hard facts into her palm. His hand was warm, rough calloused despite the expensive suit. A shock of pure, unadulterated electricity arced between them the moment his skin grazed hers. It wasn't the snap of static from a carpet. It was a lightning strike, a thunderclap in the blood. Alara gasped, her vision whitening out. The damp garden vanished. The scent of rain was replaced by the antiseptic sting of rubbing alcohol and the cloying sweetness of dying lilies. She was in a room with white walls. A machine beeped, a rhythmic, failing heartbeat. A woman lay in the bed, pale as alabaster, her beauty ravaged by a wasting sickness. But it wasn't the sickness that terrified Alara. It was the man standing over her. Not Julian. A man in robes, holding crystals, chanting nonsense, waving smoke over a chest that rattled with pneumonia. She felt Julian's presence in the memory. He was in the corner, screaming, restrained by security guards. He was begging them to administer the antibiotics, to use the ventilator, to trust the science. But the woman in the bed smiled weakly at the charlatan and whispered, "He says he can heal me, Julian. I have to believe." She saw the light go out of the woman's eyes. She felt the cavernous, hollow impact of silence. And then, she felt the cold, hard armor of rage encasing Julian's heart, a vow forged in grief. Never again would he let mysticism overrule survival. "Alara!" The shout ripped her back to the present. She stumbled, the wet grass slick under her feet. Julian had caught her by the elbows, steadying her. His face was inches from hers, his steel eyes wide, pupils blown. He was breathing hard, as if he'd run a mile. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could still taste his grief. It was bitter, like wormwood and ash. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. She refused the medicine. Because of the healer. Julian went rigid. His grip on her elbows turned into iron bands. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a statue carved from gray marble. "What did you say?" His voice was a dangerous whisper. The wind in the garden seemed to die instantly. Alara realized her mistake too late. The vision had been too visceral, the knowledge too specific. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. I just guessed. You hate this. You hate anything you can't explain." "That wasn't a guess," Julian snarled, though there was a tremor in his fury. He released her abruptly, stepping back as if she burned. He looked at his hands, then back at her, a mixture of horror and scientific confusion warring behind his eyes. I felt that when we touched. It was like a current. Julian, she stepped toward him, the instinct to comfort overriding her fear. The witchy danger was gone, replaced by a profound ache for the wounded man beneath the architect's coat. I am so sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It happens. What happens? He barked the question, retreating until his back was against the crumbling wall he despised. You hallucinate my dead wife? You read my personnel file? Is that it? Did you Google me before I arrived? No, Alara cried. I saw it. I felt it. The grief. It's a living thing in you. It's the foundation you've built your whole life on since she passed. Julian stared at her. The rational part of his brain was screaming for an exit, demanding he categorize her as a fraud, a cold reader, a manipulator, like the man who had whispered lies to his dying Sarah. But his body remembered the shock of her skin, and his soul, buried under layers of concrete logic, felt dangerously, violently seen. He straightened his coat, tugging the lapels with sharp, jerky movements. He retreated behind the wall of his professionalism, but the mortar was cracked. She could see the fissure. This inspection is over for today, he said. His voice was flat, mechanical, but his eyes were blazing. The structural integrity of the retaining wall is compromised, as is the electrical system. I will write up my report. You can't just walk away, Alara said, the wind picking up around her, whipping her mahogany curls across her face. Not after that. Watch me, Julian said. He turned on his heel and marched toward the wrought iron gate that led to the lane. He needed his car. He needed the sterile interior of his Audi, the digital dashboard, the laws of the highway. He needed to get away from the smell of sage and the woman with eyes like crushed moss who looked at him and saw the boy crying in a hospital corridor. He reached for the gate latch. It didn't move. Julian frowned, gripping the cold iron harder. He rattled it. Locked. But he hadn't locked it. He checked the mechanism. It wasn't rusted. It was simply fused, as if the metal had flowed together. Open, he muttered, rattling it violently. Damn it, open! From the porch, Alara watched him. She felt the thrum of the cottage rising up through the soles of her feet, heavier this time. Darker. The house was offended. The house knew it was being judged, and worse, it knew the man judging it was in pain. And Briarwood Cottage did not let broken things leave until they were fixed. It won't open, Julian, Alara called out softly. The wind carried her voice effortlessly to him. He spun around, his chest heaving, silhouetted against the gathering gloom of the twilight. Where is the key, Alara? There is no key, she said, wrapping her arms around herself, shivering as the temperature plummeted. You challenged the house, and now I don't think it's going to let you leave. Julian looked at the gate, then back at the woman standing in the shadows of the ivy-choked porch. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a fear that had no name. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched her, and saw a faint red mark on his palm, a burn, or perhaps a brand. The iron gate did not yield. Julian Thorne threw his weight against it, the heavy wool of his charcoal coat straining across his shoulders. But the metal held fast as if welded to the stone pillars. It wasn't locked. The latch was simply fused. He rattled it again, frustration warring with the sharp, biting ache in his right rotator cuff, a souvenir from a humid night in Fallujah, and a reminder that he was no longer 25. Logic dictated that the sudden drop in temperature had caused the metal to contract and bind. Physics, thermal expansion, simple mechanics. But the red mark on his palm throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and the wind howling through the skeletal branches of the oaks sounded less like a gale and more like a warning. Stop! Alara's voice came from behind him. It wasn't a command, but a plea. You're hurting it. Julian released the iron, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He turned slowly, planting his feet in the gravel, assuming the stance that had intimidated contractors and city councilmen for 2 decades. But Alara Vance was neither. She stood on the porch steps, the erratic light of the storm lantern casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling paint of the cottage. The wind whipped her mahogany curls around her face, wild and untamed, but she didn't shiver. She looked like a queen surveying a battlefield, wrapped in a velvet shawl the color of midnight. Hurting it? Julian repeated, his voice gravelly. It is a gate, Ms. Vance, an assembly of wrought iron and rust. It does not feel pain. However, I am currently freezing, and my vehicle is on the other side of this obstruction. "The house is listening," she said, her voice dropping to a hush that somehow cut through the wind. "Come inside, please, before the rain starts in earnest." He wanted to refuse. Every instinct in his rational, ordered mind screamed at him to climb the wall, call a locksmith, or simply kick the latch until it sheared. But then he looked at her eyes, green as crushed moss, wide with a concern that seemed to be for him, not the gate. And he looked at the house. Briarwood Cottage loomed against the darkening sky. To his architectural eye, it was a disaster. The eaves were sagging, the chimney possessed a dangerous list, and the foundation likely had water damage. Yet, as he stared at the dark windows, he felt the sensation of being watched. Not by a person, but by the structure itself. It felt heavy, judgmental. A raindrop, fat and icy, struck his cheek. Then another. Scowling, Julian turned his back on the gate and marched up the path. He bypassed Alara with a stiff nod, stepping into the foyer. "I will call a car service. Perhaps the signal is better indoors." "Perhaps," Alara murmured, closing the heavy oak door behind them. The silence that fell was absolute. The wind outside was instantly muted, replaced by the ticking of a grandfather clock and the crackle of a fire that Alara must have stoked before coming out. The air here was different, denser, sweeter. It smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something darker, like dried sage burning in a distant room. Julian stripped off his gloves, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder. He caught Alara watching him, her gaze lingering on the stiffness of his movement. "The kitchen is warmest," she said, moving past him. The velvet of her wrap brushed against his sleeve, sending a static shock through the wool that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'll put the kettle on." "I don't need tea, I need a way out," Julian muttered, though he followed her. He told himself it was because the kitchen offered the best vantage point to inspect the load-bearing beams, not because he wanted to see where she went. The kitchen was a chaotic masterpiece of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and copper pots gleaming in the firelight. It was cozy, cluttered, and completely at odds with the minimalist, sterile lines of Julian's penthouse in the city. He leaned against a butcher block island, watching her move. For a woman who had just claimed a house was alive, she moved with remarkable practicality. She filled a kettle, struck a match, and began pulling jars from a shelf. "You have a survey to complete," Alara said, her back to him as she measured dried leaves into a ceramic teapot. "And I have a house that is crumbling around my ears." Julian narrowed his eyes. "I am not a handyman, Ms. Vance. I am a restoration architect. I deal in history and structural integrity, not patching drywall." "I know who you are, Julian Thorne," she said, turning to face him. She leaned her hip against the counter, her arms crossed. The posture emphasized the soft curve of her waist and the fullness of her bust, a lushness that unnerved him as much as the house did. "You're the man who wrote the myth of structural memory. You debunk local legends by proving that hauntings are just drafts and settling foundations." "Because they are," he countered, stepping closer. The skeptical fire in his belly flared. "There is no magic in this town, Alara. There is only dry rot, subsidence, and a populace that prefers fairy tales to funding infrastructure repairs. This cottage, for instance. You think it's offended? It's settling into the water table because the drainage is non-existent." "Is that so?" Her lips quirked in a small, sad smile. "And the gate?" Thermal contraction. "And the burn on your hand?" Julian instinctively closed his fist, hiding the red mark. "Contact dermatitis. Old iron is filthy." Alara laughed softly, a sound like water flowing over stones. It irritated him. It captivated him. She turned back to the tea, pouring the boiling water. Steam rose up, carrying a scent that hit Julian in the back of the throat. Earthy, spicy, and strangely numbing. "You need to survey the town for the Historical Preservation Society, she said, changing tack. But the town records were destroyed in the fire of 56. Everyone knows the only copies of the original land deeds and the town charter are here, in my grandmother's library." Julian stiffened. She was right. He had been stonewalled at City Hall for 3 weeks. Without the original plats from the Briarwood estate, he couldn't prove the town square was built on a sinkhole, not a cursed burial ground, and the revitalization project would remain stalled. "You have the archives?" he asked, his voice guarded. "I do. Floor to ceiling. Journals, maps, deeds going back to the founding." She carried 2 mugs to the small, scrubbed pine table and sat down, gesturing for him to join her. "But the library has a leak in the roof. The north wall is bowing. And I have very little money, Julian. My divorce, well, let's just say my ex-husband was very good at hiding assets, and I was very bad at reading the fine print. Julian approached the table. He saw the play immediately. It was a negotiation. He respected that. He understood leverage. You want a barter, he stated, pulling out a chair. The wood creaked under his substantial frame. I want my home safe, she corrected, her eyes locking onto his. I want the roof fixed so the history doesn't rot away. I want the foundation stabilized so the house stops complaining. And in exchange? In exchange, you get full access. You can read every deed, every journal, every map. You can use my grandmother's records to write your report and prove to the world that Briarwood is just a boring little town with bad plumbing. Julian looked at the mug in front of him. The liquid was a dark amber, swirling with heat. His shoulder gave a particularly vicious throb, shooting pain up his neck. I can assess the damage, he said slowly, calculating the hours. I can draft the plans and oversee the contractors. I have a crew 2 towns over that owes me a favor. I can get this place watertight and structurally sound in a month. You do the work, Alara challenged. You need to touch the house, Julian. You need to understand how it was built if you want to understand the archives. He scoffed. I don't hammer nails, Ms. Vance. Then we have no deal. She took a sip of her tea, eyeing him over the rim. And good luck getting that gate open. He stared at her. The audacity. She was bluffing. She had to be. But looking at the set of her jaw, he saw a steeliness that surprised him. She was frightened of her new reality, yes, but she was desperate to protect this legacy. He recognized that drive. It was the same drive that made him obsess over saving buildings that others wanted to bulldoze. Fine, he growled. I will do the primary stabilization myself, but I bring in my own electrical subcontractors. I won't risk a fire hazard because of your atmosphere. Agreed. And I get unrestricted access to all documents. Almost all. Alara set her mug down. Her expression shifted, becoming serious, almost fearful. You may use the library on the ground floor. You may access the cellar, but you never, under any circumstances, go into the attic. Julian raised an eyebrow. Why? Is that where you keep the broomsticks? She didn't smile. It is private. It is dangerous for someone like you. The floorboards are rotted through, she added quickly, a clumsy lie that made his detective instincts flare. I am accustomed to dangerous structures, he said dryly. Promise me, Julian, or the deal is off. The attic is forbidden. He studied her face, the flush high on her cheekbones, the pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat. She was hiding something up there, likely the family secrets that fueled the local rumors, but he needed the deeds in the library more than he needed to pry into her personal space. For now. Very well, he said. The attic is off limits. He reached for his tea, expecting the bitter tannin of oversteeped black tea. He took a drink. The flavor was shocking, warm honey, sharp ginger, and the woody depth of willow bark. It washed down his throat, a spreading heat that seemed to seek out the tension knots in his body. He felt the warmth travel down his right arm, wrapping around the inflamed joint of his shoulder. Within seconds, the grinding ache that had been his constant companion for a decade didn't just fade, it vanished. Silence, where there had been noise. Peace, where there had been pain. Julian froze, the mug halfway to his mouth. He rotated his shoulder. Nothing. No click. No sharp catch. He looked up at Alara sharply. She was watching him, her fingers tracing the rim of her own cup, a look of quiet satisfaction in her eyes. What is this? He demanded, staring into the dark liquid. White willow bark for inflammation, she recited, her voice lyrical. Valerian for tension, and a little lemon balm for the sour mood. I have taken willow bark supplements before, Julian said, his voice hard, trying to reassemble his worldview. They do not work this fast, and they do not work this well. Maybe you just needed someone to make it for you with the right intention, she whispered. He set the mug down with a clatter. I do not believe in intention, Alara. I believe in chemistry. Then call it chemistry, she said, leaning forward. Call it whatever you need to, Julian, as long as the pain is gone. The air between them grew thick, charged with that same static he'd felt earlier. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as an obstacle, but as a woman. The soft light of the kitchen smoothed the worry lines from her face. She looked ethereal, yet entirely earthy. He had a sudden, irrational urge to reach out and touch the curl of hair resting on her collarbone, to see if it was as soft as it looked, to see if she would spark against his skin. He pushed the thought away, terrified by its intensity. He was a man of stone and steel. He did not court chaos. "We have an agreement," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He stood up and extended his hand. "I start the survey tomorrow. I'll bring my tools for the repairs." Alara stood as well. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. Her skin was cool, soft, contrasting with the calloused hardness of his palm. But the moment their skin touched, the reaction was violent. A tremor ran through the floorboards beneath their feet, distinct and rolling. The jars on the shelves rattled, the fire in the hearth flared brilliant blue, then roared up the chimney with a sound like a drawn breath. Julian gasped, trying to pull his hand away, but he couldn't. It wasn't that she was holding him, it was a magnetic pull, a circuit closing. The burn on his palm, the brand, seared hot, agonizing and ecstatic all at once. He saw Alara's eyes go wide, her pupils dilating until the green was almost swallowed by black. "Accepted!" The house seemed to groan around them. The word vibrating in the timber, in the glass, in the very marrow of Julian's bones. The force threw them apart. Julian stumbled back against the island, clutching his hand to his chest. Alara gripped the table, breathless, her chest heaving. The kitchen fell silent. The fire returned to its normal orange hue. The rattling stopped. Julian stared at his hand. The red mark was gone. In its place, faint silver lines traced the lifeline of his palm, shimmering like a scar that had healed over centuries, not seconds. He looked at Alara, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Logic had no explanation for this. Structural engineering could not account for the voice in the walls. "What did you just do?" he whispered. Alara looked at him, and for the first time she looked as terrified as he felt. She brought her hand to her mouth, staring at the silver mark on his skin. "I didn't do anything," she breathed, the scent of ozone and rain suddenly overwhelming the room. "The house did. You made a bargain, Julian. And Briarwood just sealed it." The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the heavy oak beams above them, a pressurized quiet that made Alara's ears pop. Outside, the world had gone mad. The sky, a bruised purple only moments ago, had collapsed into a churning wall of charcoal and slate. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, a high, thin wail that tore at the shingles of Briarwood Cottage like a jealous lover trying to scratch out eyes. Julian Thorne stood rooted to the spot, his broad chest rising and falling in a rhythm that betrayed his calm facade. He was staring at his palm, rubbing his thumb over the faint, silvery tracery that the house had etched into his skin. He looked up, his steel-gray eyes narrowing not with malice, but with the frantic calculation of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling like dry mortar. "A bargain," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You speak of this house as if it has a consciousness, Alara, as if it can sign contracts." Alara wrapped her velvet shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric soft against her bare arms. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in as many seconds. "It has a memory, Julian, and right now, it remembers something it doesn't like." She moved toward the window, her skirt brushing against the slate floor with a whisper of silk. The glass was cold, vibrating against her fingertips. Through the deluge, the ancient woods surrounding the property were bending double, thrashing violently. This wasn't a summer squall, this was a siege. "We need to check the fuse box," Julian said, his voice snapping back to its professional, authoritative register. He was retreating to the safety of mechanics, of copper wire and amperage. "The lights are flickering. If the surge protector fails—" A blinding flash of lightning turned the kitchen stark white, freezing them in a tableau of terror. A split second later, thunder detonated directly overhead, a sound so loud it rattled Alara's teeth. The overhead pendant lights flared once, a brilliant dying star, and then popped. Darkness swallowed the kitchen. "Damn it," Julian muttered from the void. Alara didn't need eyes to navigate this kitchen. It was in her blood now, a map stamped onto her soul. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool marble of the counter, finding the drawer by instinct. The scratch of a match was loud in the sudden quiet, followed by the hiss of sulfur and the blooming scent of burning wax. She lit the thick pillar candle she kept by the sink, the flame casting long, dancing shadows against the cabinets. Julian was a silhouette against the far wall, a towering figure of broad shoulders and rigid tension. The candlelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, and the silver threaded through his dark hair, turning him into something out of a Caravaggio painting. dark, brooding, and devastatingly masculine. "The storm is unnatural," Alara whispered, the flame trembling in her hand. She could smell it now. Not just the rain and the ozone, but something older. The scent of wet earth, crushed fern, and a metallic tang that tasted like danger. "We can't leave. The road will be washed out." "I have a 4-wheel drive," Julian countered, though he didn't move toward the door. He walked toward her, stepping into the circle of candlelight. He smelled of rain and expensive wool, a grounding, earthly scent that warred with the mystic aroma of dried sage clinging to her. "I don't believe in trapped, Alara. There is always an exit strategy. It's a structural imperative." "Not here," she said softly, looking up at him. Her heart did a traitorous little flip. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Briarwood has locked the doors, Julian. Metaphorically or literally, I don't know yet. But we are staying." He opened his mouth to argue, to demolish her logic with his engineering degree, but the house groaned. It was a deep, mournful sound, originating from the library down the hall. "The structural integrity of the West Wing," Julian said sharply, his head snapping toward the sound. "The support beams I warned you about. If the wind load is too high—" He didn't finish. He grabbed the flashlight from his belt, of course he had one, and strode out of the kitchen. Alara followed, shielding the candle flame with her hand, her pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against her collarbone. The hallway was a tunnel of shifting shadows. The wind outside battered the walls, sounding like heavy fists pounding for entry. They burst into the library, a vast, high-ceilinged room lined with books that Alara's grandmother had spent a lifetime collecting. The air here was thick with the smell of old paper and leather, but underneath it lay the sharp, electric tang of magic waiting to be discharged. Julian swept the beam of his flashlight across the ceiling. "There," he pointed. "Water intrusion, the plaster is buckling." He moved to the center of the room, directly under the massive, dark oak beam that spanned the width of the library. He was reaching up, trying to assess the damage, a man of science trying to diagnose a patient that defied physics. "Julian, move!" Alara screamed. Lara. She didn't know how she knew. She felt it before she saw it. A snap in the air, a vibration that traveled through the soles of her feet. The wind howled, a sudden gust slamming against the exterior wall with the force of a wrecking ball. Above Julian, the heavy iron bracket holding the centuries-old beam sheared off with a screech of tearing metal. The timber, weighing hundreds of pounds, plummeted straight toward him. He looked up, eyes wide, time slowing to a crawl. He couldn't move fast enough. It was physics. Mass times acceleration. The end. Alara didn't think. She didn't recite a spell from the Book of Shadows. She simply refused. She threw her hand out, palm open, a scream tearing from her throat. A surge of heat, liquid and golden, erupted from her solar plexus, rushing through her veins like wildfire. It exploded from her fingertips, not as a light, but as a force, a pressure so dense it felt solid. "Stop!" The air in the room condensed. The falling beam hit an invisible cushion 3 feet above Julian's head. It hovered there, defying gravity, trembling against the resistance of the air itself. The wood groaned, suspended in impossible stasis. Julian stared up at the death hovering inches from his face. Then slowly, terrifyingly, he lowered his gaze to Alara. With a gasp, Alara flicked her wrist to the right. The invisible force obeyed, shoving the massive timber sideways. It crashed into the open floor space with a thunderous boom that shook the floorboards, sending a cloud of dust and plaster debris billowing into the air. Alara collapsed against a bookshelf, her knees turning to water. The golden heat drained away, leaving her shivering and hollow. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the storm's muffled rage outside and the harsh, ragged sound of their breathing. Julian stood amidst the dust, the beam lying like a fallen giant beside him. He looked at the wood. He looked at the ceiling where it had come from. He looked at the empty air where it had hovered. Then he marched toward her. His strides were long, eating up the distance between them. He looked terrifying, dust in his hair, his coat torn at the shoulder, his eyes burning with a mixture of adrenaline and fury. "Julian, Alara began, backing up until her spine hit the rows of leather-bound grimoires. He didn't stop until he was crowded into her space, placing a hand on the shelf on either side of her head, caging her in. The scent of him was overwhelming now. Musk, rain, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. He was trembling, she realized. The stoic, unshakable architect was shaking. "Tell me what I just saw," he demanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in her chest. "Physics doesn't work that way, Alara. Gravity doesn't take a break. That beam should have crushed me." "I don't know," she whispered, her eyes wide, trapped in the gaze of his storm-gray eyes. I didn't want you to die. That wasn't adrenaline, he said, leaning closer. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of silver in his iris, the dark dilation of his pupils. I watched the air turn solid. I felt the pressure wave. You moved 1,000 pounds of oak with your hand. He was seeking logic, desperate to find the wires, the mirrors, the trick. But there was only her. Soft, terrified, impossible Alara. It's the cottage, she lied weakly, though the lie tasted like ash. It protects its own. You are the cottage, he countered, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that sent shivers racing down her arms. He wasn't yelling anymore. The anger was transmuting into something else, something volatile and hot. Stop hiding from me, Alara. I deal in foundations. I deal in truth. What are you? Alara looked up at him, her breath hitching. The skepticism in his eyes was warring with awe. He was a man who built walls to keep the chaos out, and she was the storm that had just blown his doors off. I'm a woman who is trying to figure this out, she breathed, a tear slipping down her cheek. I am just a divorced librarian who inherited a house that breathes. Please, Julian, don't look at me like I'm a monster. His expression fractured. The hardness in his jaw softened. He lifted one hand from the shelf, his rough, warm fingers brushing the tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, shocking them both. He froze, his thumb resting against her jawline, feeling the frantic pulse beneath her skin. Not a monster, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the same ozone that permeated the storm outside. I don't know what you are, but you are magnificent. Alara's lips parted. The fear was gone, replaced by a sudden, aching need. She had spent 20 years with a man who looked through her. Julian looked into her. He saw the mess, the magic, the danger, and he hadn't run. He had stepped closer. His hand slid into the hair at the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the mahogany curls. He tilted her head back, exposing the creamy column of her throat to the candlelight. Julian, she whispered, a plea and an invitation in one. Tell me to stop, he groaned, his forehead resting against hers. His breath ghosted over her lips, warm and twisting of brandy and rain. Tell me to leave, Basilara, because my logic is failing me. All I can think about is how alive you look in this light. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the hard muscle beneath the wool coat, the thunder of his heart matching her own. Don't stop. He made a low sound in his throat and closed the distance. His head dipped, his lips brushing the corner of hers, a tentative, searing promise of the kiss to come. Crash! The sound was deafening. The massive bay window at the far end of the library exploded inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the room like diamond shrapnel, glittering in the candlelight. Julian threw his body over Alara's instantly, shielding her with his coat as the wind roared into the room, extinguishing the candle in a heartbeat. The library was plunged into total darkness. But it wasn't just wind. Through the howling gale and the ruin of the window, a sound drifted in from the garden. It wasn't the storm. It was distinct, rhythmic, and terrifying. It was the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on the wet gravel, moving toward the breach in the house. Julian pulled Alara tight against him in the dark, his hand finding the heavy iron poker from the fireplace by memory. Stay behind me, he hissed into her ear, his voice devoid of romance, cold as the steel he wielded. Alara peered over his shoulder into the swirling gloom of the storm-ravaged room. A flash of lightning illuminated the broken window, and for a second she saw a silhouette standing amidst the glass and rain, a figure too tall, too broad, and far too still to be human. The figure stepped over the threshold. The hammer blow of the storm had finally ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a velvet curtain draped over Briarwood Cottage. The shattered window, now reinforced with the heavy oak shutters Julian had spent the last hour securing, held fast against the wind. The threat from the garden, whatever that shadowed silhouette had been, seemed to have dissolved back into the night, perhaps deterred by the sudden fortification of the house, or perhaps simply biding its time. Inside the library, the fire crackled, a defiant splash of warmth against the lingering chill. The air still smelled of ozone and damp earth, but beneath it, the rich, grounding aroma of roasting coffee beans and the distinct, tannic bite of the vintage Cabernet Alara had unearthed from the cellar began to take over. Julian Thorne stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel. He had shed his damp charcoal coat, revealing the pristine white dress shirt beneath. though now the sleeves were rolled to his elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He looked less like a modern architect and more like a lord of the manor inspecting his battlements. "Structural integrity is restored," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Alara's chest. He swirled the wine in his glass, staring into the crimson depths. "The frame was rotted, Alara. I told you the sash weights were compromised. It wasn't a ghost. It was physics." Alara sat on the plush velvet settee, her legs tucked beneath her. She pulled her knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders. The adrenaline that had spiked when the window blew in, and when she'd seen that figure, was beginning to curdle into something else. Something hotter. She watched Julian. He was so steadfast, so relentlessly human. In a world that was rapidly becoming terrifyingly magical to her, his reliance on logic was an anchor she desperately needed. "Physics," she repeated softly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Is that what we're calling your brute strength now? You held that shutter in place against a gale-force wind with one hand, Julian." "Leverage," he corrected, though his steel-gray eyes softened as they finally left the fire to rest on her. "And stubbornness." He crossed the room, the sound of his footsteps on the Persian rug purposeful and rhythmic. He didn't sit in the armchair opposite her. Instead, he sat on the edge of the low coffee table, bringing himself into her space, his knees brushing against the velvet of the settee. The proximity was sudden, electric. "You were trembling," he said, his voice dropping an octave. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation of fact. "When the glass broke, you weren't just startled, you were terrified." Alara looked down at her wine glass. "It's been a difficult month. My grandmother's death, the divorce, this house. The book upstairs that whispers to me," she added silently. "You're safe now," Julian said. He reached out, his fingers rough and warm, and tilted her chin up until she was forced to meet his gaze. "I checked the perimeter. The walls are 2 feet of stone. The oak is solid. Nothing gets in unless I let it." The conviction in his tone broke something inside her. It was the dam holding back weeks of loneliness, the fear of her 42nd birthday approaching with nothing to show for it but a broken marriage and a terrifying inheritance. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. She smelled the rain on his skin, the expensive starch of his collar, and the musk of a man who worked with stone and steel. "Julian," she whispered, the name tasting like a prayer. He didn't hesitate. He took the wine glass from her unresisting fingers and set it on the table, never breaking eye contact. Then his hands were on her waist, large, capable hands that knew exactly how to support a structure. He pulled her forward, off the settee, and into the space between his spread knees. "I've been trying to respect the boundaries, Alara," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips, smelling of wine and wood smoke. "I've been trying to be the professional, the architect, the friend." "I don't need a friend tonight," Alara breathed, her hands finding purchase on his shoulders, feeling the tension in his trapezius muscles. I don't know what I need." "I do." He kissed her. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a boy, nor the hungry, frantic kiss of a new lover. It was the kiss of a man who had calculated the load-bearing capacity of his own restraint and found it failing. It was possessing. His mouth moved over hers with a slow, deliberate cadence, tasting, demanding, worshipping. Alara gasped, opening to him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a current of heat that swept away the cold lingering in her bones. She felt the rough slide of his tongue, the scrape of his stubble against her sensitive skin, and the sheer, overwhelming solidity of him. He stood, pulling her up with him as if she weighed nothing. With a sweep of his arm, the architectural blueprints on the table were shoved aside, disregarded in favor of a more primal design. He lifted her, setting her on the edge of the sturdy oak table, stepping between her thighs to press his hips against her center. "Beautiful," he groaned against her neck, his lips tracing the sensitive cord from her ear to her collarbone. "You are magnificent. Symmetry." His hands roamed her body, treating her curves not as flaws to be hidden, but as sacred geometry. He mapped the swell of her hips, the softness of her waist, the heavy curve of her breasts beneath the silk of her blouse. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Alara didn't feel like a woman past her prime. She felt lush, ripe, potent. When his fingers' deftness undid the buttons of her blouse, the firelight washed over her skin. Julian pulled back to look at her, His gray eyes darkened to the color of storm clouds, pupils blown wide. He looked at her nakedness with a reverence that made her breath hitch. "A temple," he whispered, his voice rough. "I could spend a lifetime studying the lines of you." Alara wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him back to her. "Stop studying," she commanded, her voice husky with a power she hadn't known she possessed. "And come in." The act was a collision of earth and sky. Julian was grounding, heavy and rhythmic. He moved with a soldier's precision and an artist's passion, driving into her with a slow, grinding friction that set every nerve ending on fire. Alara threw her head back, her mahogany curls spilling over the blueprints, her hands gripping his hair. With every thrust, the world narrowed down to this room, this fire, this man. The fear of the Book of Shadows, the strange heritage, the divorce, it all burned away in the friction of their bodies. She felt a building pressure, not just physical, but metaphysical. A gathering of light in her belly, a hum in her blood that matched the rhythm of his hips. As the crest approached, Julian buried his face in the crook of her neck, groaning her name like a benediction. Alara shattered. The pleasure wasn't a wave, it was a supernova. It exploded from her center, radiant and golden, tearing a cry from her throat that echoed off the high beams of the ceiling. In the aftermath, silence returned, but it was different now. Heavy with musk and sweat and the sweet exhaustion of satisfaction. Julian rested his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh, his hands still gripping her hips possessively. Alara felt weightless, truly, physically weightless. She opened her eyes, a languid smile stretching across her swollen lips. "Julian," she whispered, reaching up to stroke his cheek. He pulled back slightly to look at her, a rare, unguarded smile softening the hard lines of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a word of affection, perhaps to suggest they move to the bedroom. But the words died in his throat. His eyes shifted from her face to the space above her head. The softness in his expression evaporated instantly, replaced by a confusion that rapidly hardened into shock. "Alara," he said, his voice tight. "What is that?" Alara followed his gaze. Floating in the air above the table, drifting like lazy fireflies, were dozens of glowing golden embers. They weren't falling from the fireplace. They were manifesting from the air itself, swirling in a gentle, impossible vortex directly above where they had just been joined. As she watched, one of the embers drifted down and landed on the back of Julian's hand. It didn't burn. It dissolved into a shower of harmless, glittering sparks that smelled of sage and ozone. Julian recoiled as if he'd been scalded. He stumbled back from the table, nearly tripping over the discarded rug, hastily adjusting his clothes with shaking hands. "Julian." Alara sat up, clutching her blouse to her chest, the golden lights dancing around her hair like a halo. I think it's me. It's happy. It's just energy." "Energy doesn't manifest as matter without a source," Julian snapped, the architect and the skeptic slamming back into place with violent force. He stared at the lights, then at her, his eyes cold and accusing. "What is this? Some kind of pyrotechnic? A trick?" "No, Julian, please look at it. It's beautiful." "It's impossible," he growled, backing toward the door. The intimacy of moments ago lay shattered on the floor between them. "I know how the world works, Alara. Stone, mortar, gravity, this is hallucination. Did you put something in the wine?" Alara scrambled off the table, her heart plummeting. "How can you ask that, after what we just shared?" "We shared a delusion," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and genuine fear. The fear of a man whose reality is cracking. "I don't know what game you're playing, or what kind of theatrics you've set up in this house to scare off buyers or ex-husbands, but I won't be a pawn in it." "Julian, stop!" Alara cried out, reaching for him. The golden embers flared brighter with her distress, turning from soft gold to a volatile, crackling orange. Julian flinched at the flare, his face pale. "Stay back," he warned, reaching for the doorknob. "I need to think. I need to get out of this funhouse." He ripped the door open, desperate for the cold sanity of the storm, but he didn't step out. Instead, the storm stepped in. But it wasn't the wind. The air in the library dropped 30 degrees in a single heartbeat. The fire in the hearth didn't just die. It was sucked out, the flames turning black before vanishing, leaving the room plunged into a suffocating, unnatural gray gloom. Julian froze in the doorway, his silhouette framed against a darkness that was far deeper than the night should be. He tried to move, to turn back to Alara, but his limbs were locked, frost rapidly creeping up the polished leather of his shoes. From the hallway behind him, the hallway that led to the grandmother's old room, a sound emerged. It was the screech of metal on bone, a sound so visceral it made Alara's teeth ache. The golden embers of her passion were instantly snuffed out, replaced by a heavy, cloying scent of rotting gardenias and wet grave dirt. "Found you!" a voice hissed. It didn't come from a mouth. It vibrated from the walls themselves. A vortex of black mist, darker than obsidian and colder than the void, swirled around Julian's paralyzed form. It coalesced into a towering shape, a mockery of a human figure, with limbs too long and fingers that ended in needle points of shadow. Alara screamed, raising her hands, but the entity moved with blurring speed. A tendril of shadow lashed out, striking Julian in the chest. The strong ex-Marine architect was lifted off his feet and thrown across the room like a rag doll. He slammed into the heavy oak bookshelves with a sickening crunch, crumbling to the floor, unconscious. The entity turned its eyeless face toward Alara. The wards on the windows held, but the enemy was already inside. The sound of Julian's body striking the wood echoed like a gunshot in the confined space of the library. Dust motes danced violently in the sudden displacement of air, swirling around the silhouette of the creature that loomed between the overturned armchair and the woman pressed against the wainscoting. Alara's breath hitched, trapped in a throat constricted by terror. The scent of rotting gardenias was suffocating now, a cloying, funereal perfume that masked the familiar comforts of old paper and dried lavender. The entity laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement, and raised a shadowy limb, pointing a needle-sharp finger directly at her heart. "The line ends here, little witch," it rasped. "Your grandmother was weak. You are weaker." Alara's fingers scrambled behind her, seeking purchase on the smooth plaster of the wall. Finding nothing but cold reality, she closed her eyes, waiting for the strike, waiting for the darkness to swallow the newfound light she had only just begun to kindle. A groan cut through the heavy air, low, guttural, and undeniably furious. The entity paused, its shapeless head tilting. Julian Thorne pushed himself up from the debris of splintered oak. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eyebrow, stark crimson against the pale shock of his skin and the silvered temples of his hair. He swayed on his feet, his tailored charcoal coat dusted with plaster, his vision likely swimming, yet the set of his jaw was pure granite. He was a man of structures, of load-bearing walls and tensile strength. He understood that when a foundation was compromised, you braced it. You did not run. "Get away from her," Julian growled. It wasn't a plea. It was a command born of a lifetime of ordering steel to bend and stone to hold. The shadow turned its eyeless gaze toward him. "You interrupt destiny, mortal. You are nothing, a construct of meat and bone. I'm the man who's going to tear this house down around your ears if you take one more step," Julian said, his voice steadying. He reached down, his hand closing around the heavy iron fireplace poker that had fallen from its stand. It was a crude weapon against the supernatural, illogical in the face of smoke and malice, but Julian Thorne did not believe in surrendering to the impossible. He charged. He moved with a speed that belied his 48 years, the ex-Marine surfacing through the veneer of the sophisticated architect. He didn't swing wildly, he thrust with precision, placing his body directly in the path of the entity, effectively becoming a human shield between the monster and Alara. The shadow lashed out. The blow didn't break bone this time. It passed through Julian like a wave of freezing water, a psychic shock meant to stop his heart. Julian gasped, his knees buckling as the unnatural cold seized his lungs. But he slammed the iron poker into the floorboards, using it as a cane, refusing to fall. He stood spread-eagled, a barrier of stubborn, beautiful, human defiance. "Run, Alara," he wheezed, the frost coating his eyelashes. Alara watched him, her heart shattering and reforming in a single beat. He was trembling, his skin turning a terrifying shade of gray, the life being leached from him by the proximity of the void. He was a skeptic. He believed in what he could touch, measure, and prove. And yet, here he was, dying for a magic he didn't understand, simply because he refused to let her face the dark alone. Something ancient snapped into place behind Alara's ribs. The fear evaporated, burned away by a white-hot surge of protective rage. It was the heat of the hearth, the fury of the storm, the relentless growth of ivy through stone. She didn't run. "No," she whispered. The air in the room shifted. The scent of rot vanished, replaced instantly by the sharp, electric aroma of ozone and crushed sage. The Book of Shadows, lying discarded on the floor where it had fallen, flipped open. The pages fluttered rapidly, stopping not at a spell she had read, but at a page she felt. Alara didn't need to look at the text. The words were rising in her throat, tasting of iron and honey. She stepped forward, placing her hand on Julian's back. Through the fine wool of his coat, she felt the rigid tension of his muscles, the shivering cold of his core. She pushed her warmth into him, grounding herself through his strength. "I am the root," Alara's voice resonated, no longer just her own. It carried the timbre of every woman of her line who had ever stood against the night. The entity shrieked, recoiling as golden light began to bleed from Alara's skin. "You have no covenant here!" "I am the root, and he is the stone," Alara continued, her fingers digging into Julian's shoulder. She felt him lean back into her touch, accepting the support, his breathing hitching as her warmth flooded his freezing veins. "By the blood that binds and the will that holds, I banish thee." She raised her free hand. The mahogany curls floating around her face crackled with static. The library was no longer a room. It was a vortex of power. "Ashes to ashes," she commanded. Julian, sensing the shift, didn't question the impossibility of the moment. He did what he did best. He reinforced the structure. He dropped the poker and reached back, gripping Alara's waist, anchoring her to the floorboards, holding her steady against the recoil of the magic. "Dust to dust!" Alara screamed. A blinding column of amber light erupted from her palm, striking the shadow center mass. The entity howled, a sound of tearing metal as it began to disintegrate. The black mist shredded, dissolving into harmless gray smoke that was sucked up the chimney by an unnatural draft. Silence slammed back into the room. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They stood locked together in the center of the ruined library, breathing heavily in unison. The air was warm again, smelling of beeswax and rain. Julian's legs finally gave out. He sank to the floor, but he didn't let go of Alara, pulling her down with him until they were a tangle of limbs on the Persian rug. Alara scrambled to cup his face. His skin was pale, clammy, but the steel-gray eyes that searched hers were clear. "Julian, Julian, look at me!" He blinked, reaching up to wipe the blood from his brow, wincing slightly. He looked at his hand, then at the empty space where the monster had been, and finally at Alara. His gaze traced the curve of her jaw, the wildness of her hair, as if seeing her for the first time. "That," Julian rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion, "was not in the blueprints." Alara let out a wet, breathless laugh, tears spilling over her lashes. "No, it wasn't." "You were glowing," he stated, the scientist in him trying to categorize the data and failing miserably. "Actually glowing, like a filament." "And you were freezing," she whispered, brushing her thumb over his cheekbone. "You stood between us. You could have died, Julian." Why, Julian caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. The gesture was courtly, desperate, and incredibly intimate. "Because the logic was simple, Alara. A world without you in it is structurally unsound. It would collapse. I couldn't allow that." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a terrified, reverent awe. He didn't understand the magic, perhaps he never truly would. But he understood the woman. He understood the fierce, undeniable pull that had tethered him to this cottage, to these woods, to her. "I can't explain what happened," he murmured against her skin. "I can't draw it, I can't build it, but I know I can't walk away from it." Alara closed her eyes, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her chest, her favorite rhythm in the world. "You don't have to explain it, Julian. You just have to live it. With me." "Done," he breathed, before his lips found hers. It was a kiss of salt and iron, of exhaustion and exhilaration. It was the sealing of a covenant far older than the house they sat in. Magic had found its mortar. 4 years later, the late October sun poured like melted butter over the slate roof of Briarwood Cottage. The house no longer looked like a forgotten relic. It sang. The ivy had been trimmed back to reveal the masterful stonework. The windows gleamed, and the porch, once sagging and treacherous, now stood broad and welcoming, reinforced with beams of seasoned oak. Alara stepped out to the front door, balancing a tray with 2 steaming mugs. She wore a heavy knit cardigan the color of pumpkins over a soft linen dress, her hair pinned up loosely with a silver comb that caught the light. She found him where he usually was on Saturday mornings, by the garden wall, inspecting the pointing. Julian straightened as she approached. At 52, he was perhaps more striking than he had been when they met. The silver at his temples had spread, giving him a distinguished leonine appearance, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, not from stress, but from laughter. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket and jeans, looking less like the city architect he once was and more like the lord of the manor. "Structural integrity holding up?" Alara asked, a playful lilt in her voice as she offered him a mug. Julian took the tea, an herbal blend she brewed specifically for his joints when the damp weather set in, and kissed her temple. "The lime mortar is curing perfectly. This wall will stand for another 200 years. "Good," Alara murmured, leaning into his side. "Because I just planted more climbing hydrangea. It's going to get heavy." Julian wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The connection was immediate, a hum of energy that flowed between them. Over the years, he had never developed a talent for spellcasting. He couldn't light a candle with a look or scry in a bowl of water, but he had become something else. He was her battery, her ground. When she worked the heavy healings for the townspeople who came to her back door, it was Julian's hand on her shoulder that kept her from drifting away. "Let it grow," Julian said, looking out over the garden where pumpkins ripened and the last of the medicinal herbs were drying on racks. "I'll reinforce whatever needs reinforcing." He took a sip of the tea, grimacing slightly at the earthy taste before smiling. "You put valerian in this." "You were grinding your teeth in your sleep again," she noted, smoothing the collar of his jacket. "Thinking about the Historical Society contract?" "They want to use modern cement on the cathedral restoration," he sighed, the offended purist in him bristling. "It will suffocate the stone. I have to go into the city on Monday and explain slowly why the building needs to breathe." "You'll convince them," Alara said with absolute certainty. "You have a way of making people see the truth in the stone." "And you," he countered, turning her to face him, his eyes softening to the color of the autumn sky, "have a way of making the stone feel alive." A cool breeze swept through the yard, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dried leaves. Alara shivered slightly, not from cold, but from the sudden, sharp swell of happiness. It was a long way from the terrified divorcee who had arrived here in the rain. She had found her magic in the blood of her ancestors, but she had found her home in the arms of the skeptic who built walls only to keep her safe within them. Julian set the mug down on the garden wall and took both her hands in his. His palms were rough, warm, and steady. "Happy anniversary, Alara," he whispered. "Happy anniversary, Julian." As he lowered his head to kiss her, the wind chimes on the porch began to sing, not from the wind, but from the sheer, joyful resonance of the magic that bloomed wherever they touched.